take issue with you calling this culture wars. 4 years ago, when I was alerting people to the danger of puberty blockers and a lot of the issues that we had in clinics, people like you were accusing me of fighting culture wars. And now we have the CAS review and the report that is actually a medical scandal. So I think it's really important that, especially when journalists talk about this, that you take the heat out. It's not helpful.
Okay.
It is really unhelpful to call this culture wars.
Okay.
We're trying to do the right thing by children and women in particular.
But the two things they're very different, aren't they? I mean, we were talking about puberty blockers is very different to toilets, isn't it?
Well, it's all across the spectrum.
Okay.
But the point I'm making is that when politicians are trying to do the right thing, I think it's important that you take it at face value rather than casting aspersions on the motivation.
After the Health Secretary Victoria Atkins told us yesterday how she was trying to stop the NHS eradicating women in their language, the Business Secretary and Equalities Minister Kemi Badenoch takes up the fight today. She wants your help in identifying organisations that are giving the wrong guidance on single-sex spaces. We can speak to Kemi Badenoch now. Good morning.
Good morning.
What makes you think that this is happening?
I know it is happening. I don't think it is happening. I know it is happening. And I have seen instances of schools that have got this wrong, which is one of the reasons why we put out the guidance for gender questioning children. Obviously, the Health Secretary embedded in the NHS Constitution, single-sex spaces. But across the board, in public and, to be honest, even in private institutions, we see a lot of confusion, people not knowing the difference between sex and gender identity, a lot of confusion about what the law actually is. There was a lot of guidance that was put out by organisations like Stonewall that was actually quite different from what the Equality Act says. And what I'm asking for is people to send examples, especially from public institutions, where we can have a look at guidance across the board to make sure that it is in accordance with the law.
Right. And what happens if there are very few examples? The reason I ask that is because clearly there are some people who might be confused. But is this just kind of stoking the culture wars rather, that this is something that's very tiny, doesn't really happen that often? In fact, it doesn't happen often enough that you're having to ask people to send you in examples.
No, not at all. Why do you think this is something that doesn't happen that often and it's very tiny?
Because you're asking for examples. I mean,
yes, I'm asking for examples to make sure that we tackle things that we might not have noticed, not because it's rare. There's so much out there, and it's actually a lot more laborious for us to go out and look for it, and that's actually intrusive. But I do take issue with you calling this culture wars. 4 years ago, when I was alerting people to the danger of puberty blockers and a lot of the issues that we had in clinics, people like you were accusing me of fighting culture wars. And now we have the CAS review and the report that is actually a medical scandal. So I think it's really important that, especially when journalists talk about this, that you take the heat out. It's not helpful.
Okay.
It is really unhelpful to call this culture wars. We're trying to do the right thing by children and women in particular.
But the two things they're very different, aren't they? I mean, we were talking about puberty blockers is very different to toilets, isn't it?
Well, it's all across the spectrum.
Okay.
But the point I'm making is that when politicians are trying to do the right thing, I think it's important that you take it at face value rather than casting aspersions on the motivation.
Okay.
I'll give you an example. There was a report, and this was confirmed by doctors, that there were girls who were not using the toilets in some schools and getting urinary tract infections because they didn't want to share their toilets with boys. That's a scandal. And that's something that we should be looking at. Please don't call it culture wars.
Okay. I mean, I'm not the only person who calls it a culture war.
But you're the one I'm speaking to
Of course. We've got people getting in touch with us already this morning saying, make sure that you don't let the government get away with stoking culture wars. This is something that people, people obviously have different views on this. Some people are concerned, as you say, for example, those girls who don't want to go to the toilets. If you're a parent of that girl, you'd be concerned about that. And other people...
If they're getting infections.
Of course, yes.
Absolutely.
I would be if that was my daughter. However, there are also people who believe that this is a culture war, and we're just trying to reflect
that. That is why I'm on here to explain what it is we're trying to do. So it's this, and I've seen, even in my own department, I've seen guidance that it was not quite right, and we just have a job to fix it, and that's really what we're trying to do here.
Okay, I want to talk about migrants, if I may. Britain has removed the first asylum seeker to Rwanda this week. This is the first time we've sent someone to a third country. Should we be trumpeting this because this was under the voluntary scheme? They were not deported.
Well, the easiest cases will be the first ones. I do think that we should be trumpeting it because one of the big arguments about this scheme was that Rwanda was not a safe country, and actually people are volunteering to go there. I know people who go there on holiday. Lots of people have been, and we need to get away from a lot of the myths about this African country, which is actually a leader on the continent in terms of what it's been able to achieve, both economically and around law and order as well.
They went voluntarily, but we're, as a taxpayer, we give them £3,000. We're also going to be paying Rwanda to give them free board and lodgings for 5 years. So it's not, it doesn't come without its cost. I wonder how many people you expect. Do you expect many people to go voluntarily?
Well, I'm not in the Home Office, so I don't have a lot of the figures that they might be able to give you. What I can say is that if we were not sending people there, even at this minimal cost, I would be accused, for example, of the very high costs of keeping people in this country. There is no cost-free option here. There is no cost-free option. But I think that this is the right policy. It is obviously already acting as a deterrent if we look at what the Irish government has been putting out. But just assuming that policing our borders can be done for no money whatsoever it's just not serious. It's going to cost us something, whatever it is we do.
Okay. The Times is reporting this morning that an IT blunder meant letters to asylum seekers went to the wrong address, and as a result, you've been unable to locate more than half. I appreciate it's a complex system, but these kind of stories perhaps wouldn't fill people with confidence.
Well, my understanding is the Home Office has denied the story about people going missing. What I was told was that some people have not checked in. That doesn't mean that they have gone missing. That is a red flag for the authorities to go in and check on them.
But they might be gone already. They might have just disappeared. That's the point, I suppose.
Well, the only alternative to that is detention, which is illegal. So we're not going to do that either, are we?
No, but
exactly.
it's a very difficult situation.
It really is. Policing borders, managing migration is unbelievably difficult. There are no easy options. There are no cost-free options. But we are doing the very best. It is only this government that has a plan. Even the legal migration figures, which were quite high last year, they're already coming down because we are taking action.
Okay, I've got one final thing I want to ask you about. You are backing a report this morning from the IEA. We're going to speak to them later, which claims the British Empire and the slave trade were not responsible for the United Kingdom's prosperity. And I know that you've argued this point recently. And when you did, the historian William Dalrymple said Kemi Badenoch needs to learn some history and not let ideological wishful thinking overcome historical facts. I presume you stand by what you said.
Yes, of course. And historians, Professor Robert Toombs, Professor Neil Ferguson, and Professor Nigel Bigger all said that I was correct and William Dalrymple was wrong. This is obviously a contested issue, but I'm very pleased that I have very eminent historians on my side. The point that we are making is that what made Britain, and to be honest, Western Europe and the US wealthy was those values of liberalism, the rule of law, property rights. And if you stop focusing on those, you will end up doing things that are actually reducing growth rather than increasing growth and prosperity. And that's the point that I was making.
Right. And other people will say, just finally, that, that in terms of compensating slave owners, that there was a particular debt that the United Kingdom was paying, which was only paid off in 2015, so that there was an economic consequence, was there not?
There might have been an economic consequence, but the point we're making is that is not what made the United Kingdom wealthy. It certainly made some individuals wealthy, but that was not what made the United Kingdom wealthy. Okay,
Kemi Badenoch, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for talking to us. That is the Business Secretary and Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch.
So interesting the one line she said, she doesn't believe in such a thing as a culture war. And there are some people who agree with her. There are some people who say, of course, she knows it's a culture war. One line that I just brought me up short is there's an implied criticism of journalism generally, I think, as we're here, which is you have to take what politicians say at face value. Which would imply that all politicians only do things for simple, stated, overt reasons. And that strikes me as fundamentally unlikely when you look at the human psyche. Politicians, of course, don't do that. Politicians do things for political reasons. That's why they're politicians. The notion that you should be sort of told off for looking behind motivations, looking behind statistics, looking behind stories, because you should take them at face value, seems to me to be extraordinarily wrong-headed, actually, and a way of just trying to decline questions, decline legitimate conversation. Of course, you can't take what politicians say at face value because they don't think about them at face value. They think about them at other levels as well. Is it a culture war? That's a really good question. Lots of people saying it is, of course, a culture war. Some people saying this is more serious stuff. And I think that's the answer. That seems to me to be the legitimate question. How much is this a pressing issue for you? For some of you, it will be very pressing. For some of others of you, you'll say the business secretary should have more on our mind to do with business than this. And that split seems to be coming in as we go through that conversation. So many people talking about it as we do. Most of England will be heading to the polls tomorrow for local elections as well as mayoral elections in many of England's biggest cities. Labour is expecting a good night, but could it be more difficult for them than many thought? Let's speak to Bridget Phillipson, the Shadow Secretary of State for Education. Good morning to you.
Hello, good morning.
And we just had Kemi Badenoch on in fairly feisty form, and she was talking about the need for single-sex spaces like toilets and how important it was to find out all the examples of public bodies not giving over enough places like toilets to women. And she objected to the phrase culture war. She said when people say this is just the government waging a culture war, that is deeply, deeply wrong, and she's just trying to do the right thing. Do you think the government engages in a culture war?
I don't think they're doing this in good faith. I'll come on to the wider politics of this, but just in terms of the initial substance of issues such as single-sex wards within hospitals, this is a real concern, and women should expect dignity when they're in hospital, the right to privacy and the right to feel safe. But the reality is, under Kemi Badenoch's government, we've seen a massive explosion in the use of mixed-sex wards because the NHS is in an absolutely parlous state. So I think people will judge Conservative ministers by their actions, not simply by their words. And the reality is that for many women, they're denied the respect and the dignity that comes of single-sex provision within NHS hospitals because of people like Kemi Badenoch and her government. And she does love nothing more than a culture war, and it is so transparent what she is doing. She is pitching to Conservative members for the leadership contest to come in the Conservative Party. And frankly, our country deserves a lot better than it always being about the Conservative Party. It's about what's best for the British people.
But some people say it's hard for you to make the moral argument when it comes to things like safe spaces for women, because it's true to say, I think, Bridget Phillipson, that people in your party, including your leader, spent months and months and months wibbling on this situation. They couldn't say what a woman was. You had these absurd situations where people saying people who aren't a woman can have a vagina and things like that. You did not have a strong base to say we protect women because you couldn't even define a woman as a party for a long time. And that's what I think some people think it's hard for you to criticise the government in this area.
Look, you know, I'm a woman. I'm speaking to you this morning. I'm happy to have that conversation about how we define these terms. But
you weren't. People in your party weren't a year ago. It feels like the pendulum has swung, and you're happy to do it now. But a year ago, 18 months ago, people in your party were not happy to have that conversation.
Look, I think this is about a wider question of how we recognise that absolutely biological sex matters, but it is incumbent upon all of us to treat everyone that we speak to seek to make sure that everyone within our country has dignity and is treated in a respectful way. And sadly, much of this conversation will sometimes drift into a rather toxic and unpleasant discussion. And where, for example, it comes to young people and to children, I'm clear that I want to make sure that they are properly supported, that their well-being is right at the heart of everything that we talk about where it comes to these difficult and sensitive issues. But we will not get to a better position on this. We do not advance the argument around how we treat people with respect if we have ministers seeking to inflame the language and the rhetoric around this. And I think people can see it for exactly what it is, which is an attempt to stoke division rather than seek to provide practical solutions to what can be knotty issues of public policy.
George Galloway said yesterday that he's in talks with a Labour peer and 3 Labour MPs about switching sides to his Workers' Party. He declined to name the potential defectors as they were not yet nailed on. How worried are you on a scale of 1 to 10 of losing Labour MPs to George Galloway's party?
I would take anything he says with a big pinch of salt, is what I would say to that. And Again, there's another person who was more interested in stoking division than seeking to unite communities.
One policy you're responsible for that gets our listeners going in both sides, it has to be said, is about the VAT exemption on private schools. There was a report this week about rising fees being passed on already by private schools. And some of our listeners are, I know this for a fact, Bridget Phillipson, are grandparents who are scraping money together to send their grandkids to schools. Do you recognise that there are some not especially wealthy people who are going to be disadvantaged by your policy in this area?
I recognise that parents will seek to do what's right by their children, and in some cases grandparents will be supporting wider family around the choice of school. That won't change under a Labour government. But what I'd also point out is that what's happened year after year after year is that private schools have whacked up their fees way beyond inflation. It's no good them suggesting that this is somehow down to the Labour Party. They have responsibility in this. They are pricing people out of the schools that they operate. And like everybody else, they can make choices about what they charge and how that money is passed on. My priority is to use that money that we would raise through ending the tax breaks that private schools enjoy to make sure that we've got more teachers in our classrooms, that we're providing more mental health support for our children and better training and development for teachers. We know that state schools are under enormous pressure at the moment. We know that lots of young people are facing really big challenges around their mental health, and I would prioritise their needs over the needs of private schools.
And when will you phase it? That's a question that some people want the answer to. Will that happen immediately? Day 1, day 10 of your Labour administration, immediately that happens, the VAT exemption comes off?
We'd want to get on with it because we want to invest that money directly into our state schools. Parents listening to this programme this morning, the vast majority of whom, send their children to state schools. We're talking about, 93% of the population. They want to know how a Labour government will make sure that those schools are well supported and that their children are given every chance to succeed in life. And that's absolutely what I would want to deliver as Education Secretary in a Labour government.
Bridget Phillipson, good to speak to you. Thank you for joining us.